Shotgun to shotgun.
I had a network issue. Just ratified some few minutes ago. So my sincere apologies. I hope you can all hear me now.
No, it's okay, brother. It's okay. The floor is yours. We're ready. Don't worry about it. Technical issues won't stop the show.
Okay. Greetings to everyone. We we have to understand the peculiarities of the continent. I mean, some of the peculiarities of the continent explains. I mean, what had happened for the past few minutes. I mean, some of these peculiarities explain. I mean, expresses itself in terms of how much we have access to. I mean, the basic things that one would have expected any society in the 21st century. I mean, should be available with the question of um, uh, network service providers and what have you. So I'm sharing. I'm passing my apologies once more for joining the meeting late. So I think the discussion really is for me to look at the topic. Things come together. An African mind in an African head allows us to build our best selves. And I want to appreciate the initiative. I want to appreciate Brother Kujicha Guli for coming up with this important topic, and also the other co-hosts that we have in our midst for coming up with this brilliant topic. I think more than any other time, the relevance of discussions of this nature, most especially the question of the African mind, is always striking at whatever point in time, because many of us we are yet to grapple with the understanding of the fact that no matter how much you talk about it, we are clearly living in an era where some of us have termed, like Chinwezu have termed, the post-traumatic slave syndrome era. And we see this era across not just the continent, but the global African community. I mean, we are talking about an era where it has almost become impossible to become an African, even in Africa. Uh, I think it was around last month, I was going through a particular video interview of Professor Smalls, James Moss, and in that short clip, he had said that that the African continent is not what many of our brothers and sisters in the diaspora think of it, in the sense that he said that an African person could be lynched on the streets of Ghana just for claiming right, or for claiming to be involved in African spirituality. You can't be shot merely for saying that you are an adherent of any African spirituality. And that statement, when I watched that video clip, I I mean, it sent something down to my spine. I was, because that's the reality of the African continent, really. Um, you cannot walk on the streets of major African countries and, be proud of, or walk on the streets and, put out your shoulder that you are a member or an adherent of an African spirituality without not necessarily being attacked by your fellow, African nationals. And we see this across the continent, which makes us believe that the African continent, basically at this material point in time, is what you can call an encampment, a colonial and also a slave encampment. We are encamped on the continent by Arab imperialism and European imperialism. We've been battling with this for centuries, on the continent. And we battling with these realities have made it to be so pervasive to such extent that a lot of our persons down here, a lot of African persons down here are taking it to be, a norm. So we can't question the agenda of the Arab imperialists, and we cannot even question the agenda of the European imperialists today on the continent in the most unfortunate manner. And it is also worsening to such extent that today, on the continent, at least for some of us, we are talking about the dominance of European imperialism. But not enough of our people, even within our small number, encourages us or wants us to talk about the effects of the Arab imperialism. You see, they've taken it upon themselves that identifying with the Arab imperialist agenda, is a norm. So why should we question, the agenda of the Arab imperialists? In fact, does quote unquote an Arab imperialist exist on the continent at all? So we are battling with all of these issues, and that's why I think that the topic given to me by the host is extremely important. And it's not just important for those of us on the continent, but for the global African community. Before going into the subject matter proper, let me just start off by reading some quotes, which I believe most of you must have had access to or must have encountered before this time. Some of these quotes were put together by the person of Marcus Garvey and also Walter Rodney. Garvey had said that a people without the knowledge of their past, history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. Garvey also said that liberate the minds of men, and I had women, and ultimately you will liberate the bodies of men, and I had women. Garvey had also said, to be once defeated is to find cause for an everlasting struggle to reach the top. To be once defeated is to find cause for an everlasting struggle to reach the top. To Rodney said, every African has a responsibility to understand the system and work towards its overthrow. Rodney had also said that the simple fact is that no people can enslave another for centuries without coming out with a notion of superiority. And when the color and other physical traits of these peoples were quite different, it was inevitable that the prejudice should take a racist form. Now, what these two quotes by Garvey and Walter Rodney teaches us that the question of cultural imperialism on the continent is a necessity. If we understand, if we go through the submission of Walter Rodney and also the submission of Garvey, necessity in the sense that it is fundamental, or it was fundamental, for instance, for the Arab imperialists, to say that our skin color equates to to abandonment, equates to lesser human beings, substandard human beings, equates to quote unquote, third world or third, set of people, third human being or lesser human beings, basically. And it was also relevant and important and fundamental for the European imperialists to also say that, that our skin color equates to what you can get in any lesser society. Because without not doing these things, it will be impossible for them to be able to carry out their ultimate agenda, which is to render us economically, politically, subservient, which is the reality of the African continent that we have today. And I think it is on this basis that some of us always return to the speeches and the submissions of Malcolm X, who had also taught us that, the question of we hating on ourselves is not just accidental or normal. That is for an African person to say that he or she is not proud of the black skin color, our melanin, or proud of our hair texture, the broadness of our nose, our skin, our body features, basically. Malcolm has taught us that all of these things are not also natural. There's nothing fashionable about it. There's nothing fashionable about we wanting to, destroy our melanin in order to have quote unquote glow skin, or to to whiten our skin color. All these things are not natural, are not artificial, are not, they are not natural. They are not accidental. They are products of our age-long oppression, which has, incorporated or manifested itself in our economic, subservient states or subserviency, which we have at this material point in time. let me say that the continent, for instance, has been identified to be one of the biggest market for skin bleaching cosmetics. We see this in terms of how it is easier for skin bleaching cosmetic companies, biggest skin bleaching cosmetic companies to invade our, our market in places like Ghana, Nigeria, and all of that unrestrictedly. I mean, you don't have a government telling them to, I mean, this is how you carry out your business. No, 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 no. It is unrestricted. So they come in from everywhere, from India and what have you. Be it in Ghana, be it in Kenya, be it in Namibia, across the continent, basically, most of these bleaching cosmetic companies and also weave industries, air industries and what have you, they make chunk of money, yearly, annually, from our ignorance on the continent, from the quote unquote, the eating on ourselves on the continent. So we see that the whole, old adage of we eating on ourselves in order to love their wealth, is a reality. And that is why for us, in tackling the question of the African mind, what also comes straight to our mind is we understanding the question of power. Because we don't think that the racial oppression that had led to the current inferiority complexity of most of our people, that, it has nothing to do with power. It has a lot to do with power. It has a lot to do with power. It has always been projected through power also. And that is why for us, we return also to some of the statements and then the submissions of great revolutionary Pan-Africanists like Chinwezu. Chinwezu had said in his book, The Decolonizing African Mind, Decolonizing the African Mind, Chinwezu had said that the central objective in decolonizing the African mind is to overthrow the authority which alien traditions exercise over the African. The white and Arab supremacy beliefs and structures which uphold them have to be destroyed. What Chiwezu is telling us, in other words, is that, the objective of we decolonizing our minds must also manifest itself through our ability to destroy the white and also the Arab supremacist structures, because without not understanding how these structures work, the modus operandi, it will be difficult for us to be able to grapple with, the extent at which these structures, these social values, these oppressive structures, these oppressive social values, had annihilated us or had annihilated us from our realities as African people. We also draw our inspiration from the works of Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon in his book, Black Skin, White Marks, now done an excellent work, for us as global African people to understand the effects of racial oppression and how the question of the African mind cannot be, jettisoned or cannot be treated as a second-class question. For Fanon, he had said that if there's anything that we have to, recollect as African people, it is the question of our personality, the African personality. And I think Cabral also echoed this question, the question of we getting back our African personality. Some persons have asked that, why is it that we discuss why is it that we are discussing, quote unquote, the African personality, the question of the African personality today, 21st century? And I used to say to them that look around you, look across the continent, into other people's cultures and traditions, and tell me if there's any of these existing people, existing group, whose cultures and traditions are basically being inspired by other people. I ask this, I usually reply to some of these questions in that manner by asking them to look into other people's cultures and traditions and tell us which of these persons, practices or live cultures and traditions that are quite different from their own antecedents, and it will be difficult for them to pinpoint. it will be difficult for them to pinpoint a particular group. It is because, as we used to say, the African continent, today, for instance, like I may mention of earlier on, is an encampment, an encampment for two major imperialists, the European and also the Arabs. And all of these things have been taken to be the norm, have been taken to be the norm. So you cannot question all of these things because they exist. And, what are you going to do about its existence? No government on the continent is talking about this. And that is why for us as Pan-Africanist revolutionaries, we see all of these things. And we are saying that to attack or to recollect our African personalities, as Fagunwa Adoda us, we must confront, the power structure, the basic power structure that had made this to become a reality which we cannot question today on the continent. Let me also take my presentation to a more contextual level by asking the question of what is the African mind? The African mind that we have established that we must recollect. What do we basically mean when we mention the word African mind? Well, Fagunwa had also helped us out in understanding what we mean by the African mind. The African mind to Fagunwa is one that lives the basic social realities and conditions of its immediate society. That is, an African mind must be a mind that understands the social realities and conditions of the African people. The realities in this context can be interpreted to be political, can be interpreted to be economic, can also be interpreted to be sociocultural, understanding the social realities and conditions of the people and also the continent. By so doing, it will be almost impossible for you not to understand the cultures of the people, the traditions of the people, the spirituality of the people, the way of life and what have you. That, to us, as given by Fagunwa, is what we understand the African mind to be. But how many, quote unquote, African minds do we have across the global African community? We have fewer, unfortunately. We have fewer because of the antecedent that you and I know about. Our history of the history of slavery, and also the history of colonialism. Because these experiences, these unfortunate experiences, are being perpetuated clearly to delineate us from who we are, to destroy our identity and what have you. And that's why, we are living in what we called earlier on the post-traumatic slave syndrome era, an era where it has almost become impossible for us to understand the nature and character of our Africanity. The necessity for global Africans to strike powerful blow against this reality means that we must recollect our African personality. We must recollect our African mind. But for what purpose would be the recollection of our African minds? What are the basic purposes that they can serve in the 21st century? I know I'm not saying anything fundamentally new by saying that once we recollect our minds, our African minds, because Gavi had heard most of these views, what we're doing, in other words, is we are restoring our self-esteem, we are restoring our self-confidence, and we are restoring our self-respect. But let me just add that the question of self-esteem, the question of self-confidence, and self-respect are the basic ingredients, if you as an individual, want to develop what you can call personal, upliftment. For you as an individual to experience any form of personal development, you must necessarily have, strands, and in fact, more strands of self-esteem, self-confidence, and self-respect. But your personal development is not just meant for you as an individual, because as a member of a race, you must understand that once you have been gifted to such extent that you have developed yourself personally, it will become most impossible for the immediate society you're living in to also develop. Because for us to have national development in whatever form, in whatever shape, there is a necessity for personal development. So there is a nexus between personal development and national development. And I'm using the word national because, you know, I'm not using it by being oblivious of the fact that, you know, we are not proud of the basic nationalities that we have across the continent today, because they are clearly the makings of the European colonizers, you know. But I'm just putting it in a contextual manner for us to be able to, you know, see clearly what we can benefit from having or retrieving our African mind. The question of personal development, national development, which in turn or its end result would always be racial development, you know, cannot be thrown into the trash can at whatever point in time in our history. But why do we need to lay emphasis on the question of we getting back our minds as African people? I return to Cabra. Cabra said, and I quote, "The experience of colonial domination shows that in the effort to perpetuate exploitation, the colonizers not only create a system to repress the cultural life of the colonized people, it also provokes and develops the cultural alienation of a part of the population. As a result, a considerable part of the population assimilates the colonizers' mentality. A reconversion of minds of mental state is this indispensable, is thus indispensable to the true integration of people into the liberation movement. Such reconversion, re-Africanization, in our case, may take place before the struggle, but it is completed only during the course of the struggle." I'll take that last part again. Cabra said, such reconversion, that is, we retrieving our African mind, such reconversion, such re-Africanization, in our case, may take place before the struggle, but it is completed only during the course of the struggle. So what Cabra is saying basically is that we wanted to retrieve our African mind. You know, the process of we doing that cannot be completed. You know, ultimately, if we do not, you know, struggle to destroy the power structures upon which all of these realities are being formed and are being, you know, perpetuated. So there is a nexus between we identifying how we can retrieve our African minds and we waging a major struggle against the basic structures and systems that have made it compulsory for us to see ourselves as every other thing but African. I return to the continent because what I'm doing also is to give you all you know, a graphic picture of the state of the continent today. As I said in my introduction, the state of the continent is not one that one can be proud of because we have a terrible ruling class on the continent. I think myself and some of my comrades, we used to give this analogy. And this analogy speaks about everything really, everything that we need to discuss about the extent of the effects of Arab and European imperialism. This analogy goes thus. We would say that, imagine for an instance, in Lagos, Nigeria, that, I mean, we have the president of Nigeria in Lagos, he came down from Abuja to Lagos, and it was caught by, say for an instance, by Trump, that, you know, a missile, unfortunately, you know, had just, you know, mistakenly, you know, you know, been discharged mistakenly at the NASA office in Washington or whatever, and you know that this missile unfortunately has two places to drop. Is either this missile drops in Mecca or Abuja, you know, because the whole NASA people have tried to look at the only possibility, the best possibility of where this missile could drop. That Trump they called the president Buhari who is a Muslim element, that, this missile has just two places to drop. It either drops in Abuja, the capital of Nigeria, or in Mecca, the religious household of Muslims. And Trump posed the question to Buhari to choose which of these places is the best alternative for the best option for Buhari. We used to say that a President Buhari who holds his allegiance, to the Arab oligarchy, we say that, to hell with the bomb, let the missile drop in Abuja right now, but not in Mecca. That is what the response, literally, that is what the response will be for a Nigerian president who resides in Africa. And it is the same reality if you have a Christian president. The battle between Jerusalem and whatever capital you have in Africa, they will ask whoever is putting that call through to allow the missile to drop ASAP in whatever part of Africa, but not in Jerusalem, nor in Mecca. So these are concrete realities that shows that we have a terrible ruling class on the continent that is not, they are not basically interested in retrieving our African identity, because they do not even have an understanding of what it is, to be an African even in Africa. And we see this with so many examples. For an instance, it is true that today you have more persons involved in African spirituality outside the continent than you could get on the continent. As massive as the African continent is, you have more Obatala worshippers, you have more Ifa worshippers, you have more of these persons outside the continent than you can get in the continent. In fact, merely because I was working on Brazil for some of my academic papers and what have you, my research basically. And the veneration of Yoruba spirituality, for an instance, is in spite of the fact that the Brazilian state had made several attempts to, emasculate these persons, the veneration of African Yoruba spirituality in Brazil cannot be compared to what you have across the Yoruba land, post-colonial Yoruba land, today's Yoruba land in Nigeria. That is, you have more adherents of this spirituality in Brazil than you can ever get in Nigeria, in Yoruba land, where it originated. So, when we are saying that the continent basically is an encampment, it's like a camp, we are saying this because that's the reality, but that confronts us, that's the reality, the reality that we are slaves right there on the continent, actually. No matter how much you talk about it, people proud themselves around, speaking for those that still think of their indigenous language. They speak all of these languages, they do this and all of that, but they don't live the the basic African social values, because they really do not understand it. We're talking about years of oppression. And the colonial educational system, has done so much, to destroy this ability. And when we talk about the educational system, these are areas where we begin to identify the basic racist structures, racist, systems that refused us, which we know we never allow us to even understand what we mean by the African personality or the need for us to retrieve the African mind. Comrades, as it stands today, as it was in the days of colonialism of the continent, I don't need to remind you that the inspiration to defeat colonialism on the continent was gotten outside the continent, outside the continent, with the works of the likes of Marcus Garvey, the likes of the 1900 Pan-African Congress, the works of the boys, and the works of this Trotskyist, I've forgotten his name now, with the works of some of these persons, I mean, outside the continent, basically, the likes of Kwame Nkrumah, the likes of Azikiwe in Nigeria, the likes of these persons, were able to understand the need for them to come down to the continent and wage a major struggle against the colonizers. The inspiration for us to fight this oppressive system, which we believe on the continent today has held us down mentally and physically. We also have to be gotten from the diaspora. There is a need because, and which is the whole point about the necessity of Pan-Africanism. The necessity of Pan-Africanism gives us that global outlook to our struggle. And, as Malcolm X had said, no African person can be respected outside, the continent if the African continent is in a backward state. The African continent, morally, psychologically, physically, spiritually, what have you, it is currently in a backward state. And there's a necessity for us to go back to that solidarity, that Pan-African solidarity of the 19th century, to then see how we can collaborate with Pan-African revolutionary movement of the continent on how we can wage a major struggle against, the continuing effects of Arab imperialism and European imperialism, neocolonialism, in its most naked outlook. Given this reality of the African continent, it is also important for us to see to what extent has the diaspora, contributed to this, to the struggle against these realities. I would say that the diaspora, going back to what I've just said about the Pan-African solidarity of the 19th century, of the 20th century rather, sorry, that the diaspora had done well, in putting their agenda forward that there is a necessity for us to retrieve our African identity, our African minds, and what have you. But there are still some basic limitations. And I see these limitations today is clearer within the context of how much our persons in the diaspora, even the brightest of our revolutionaries in the diaspora, have this illusion over the post-colonial structures that we have on the continent. For instance, there was this debate that I engaged in, I think about 2 months ago. I was involved in this debate about, these were some of our comrades in the diaspora, and they were talking about the possibility of working with AU, working with some specific African governments and, what have you, in order to come down and, do some works and what have you. I said, no, that is not you can never get anything done by so doing, really. Because these are the same members of the ruling class that have held us down on the continent, that have made it possible for us to even understand our Africanity. Even in Africa, you cannot get anything done with these elements, not even AU. And we engage in a very, an extensive debate, trying to say that the AU itself is an imperialist organization. What organization, what continental organization would allow, the Chinese imperialists to build its headquarters? So we cannot share in any, we cannot illusion in the existence of any of these, structures. Structures that clearly have nothing to do with our liberation as African people. So I'm saying that as much as it has been the analysis, the works, the struggles of our brothers and sisters in the diaspora have been in waging a war against, the domination of European imperialism, Arab imperialism, as much as all of this, force, has been formidable, it is also important for us to understand the political realities of the African continent, that we cannot, share in any illusion in the existence of all of these structures. At best, if you want to assist the African people on the continent, in in defeating neocolonialism, what we have to do is to work with the working people, the ordinary people, the ordinary masses, the working people generally, but not the government, not the AU, not the ECOWAS, not the SEDAC and all of these, regional organizations and what have you, because they are imperialist in nature. They are imperialist in nature. They are imperialist in nature, and they do not, conceal their agenda. They are proud of it. They are proud. They work majestically, on the continent, across the continent, parroting, imperialist ideas and what have you. They have a very tiny, bourgeois class, economic bourgeois class who assist them in parroting these ideas. For an instance, in Zambia, the entirety of the basic sectors in Zambia today are currently under the whims and caprices of the Chinese. Any one of you want to travel to Zambia, for an instance, the national airport in Zambia, ordinarily you should be welcome by another colonial language, English language, ordinarily. But today in Zambia, the official language that welcomes you, starting from the national airport, is Chinese. Because the Zambia government took some certain amount of loans from the Chinese government and they could not repay, and the Chinese government took over the airport. And you should know the Chinese. They are as terrible as the other imperialists that we have, destroying the entirety of planet Earth today. They replace the entirety of anything English in that airport and replace it with Chinese. So these are basic realities that confront us, and which has made it impossible for an ordinary African on the continent to even begin to think of the necessity of getting back his or her African identity, to even begin to see himself or herself within the light of, quote unquote, a peculiar Africanity. So when we begin to think about these realities, I, for an individual, then push forward this notion that there is an economic system, and I know that I'm not saying anything new by mentioning this economic system, which is the capitalist economic system, that has made it possible for us on the continent to be economically, not just on the continent, actually, the global African community, to be mentally and physically subservient to the existing power structures, the Arab and also the European structures that have made it possible for us to be proud of our Africanness. This economic structure, we see this economic structure everywhere. We see this economic structure in our health sector. We see this economic structure in our educational sector, transport sector. The basic economic structures. I've mentioned the health sector. And I think the health sector, more than any other time in more recent times, we have been able to see how the health sector, with the whole COVID-19 something, how the health sector itself, had expressed the extent upon which there's a domination of, neocolonialism and also the basic ideas of capitalism. For instance, we were informed at first when the Madagascar government said that they had initiated a particular drug for COVID-19. And let me say that the first set of persons, the first set of individuals that castigated the Madagascar government for even coming up with any initiative different from what WHO would say, the first set of elements were actually the African government, across the continent. Then after the African government, the ignorant African youth on the continent, and also some elements, members of the ruling class and what have you, rich guys, also took turn to castigate the initiative of the Madagascar government. Actually, they said before WHO could say anything, they said that that what the Madagascar government came up with, I mean, is nothing to reckon with. That it's fake, and I mean they tried to destroy it and what have you. Even before WHO could release any statement, because of the backwardness of the minds of the ruling class we have on this continent, and also some of our persons, unfortunately, they have condemned that initiative. So that when WHO also began its antics, it wasn't surprising anymore, because on the continent, some persons have laid the foundation and they have actually legitimized the condemnation that WHO could come up with. And, what we were saying then was this: no matter how much you talk about it, the Nigerian government was there, the Ghanaian government was there, Zambia government was there, Kenya government was, and all of these governments were there, but they could not even come up with any initiative, no matter how small it was. They could not even, invent anything whatsoever. So we're saying that even if, quote and unquote, what, the Madagascar government was parading, even if it were to be fake, posterity will judge that country better than it would have done for any other African country, because this country, Madagascar, could think out of the box. While you all were parroting what WHO was saying and other, mainstream media were saying. So we begin to see that there is a connection between our current oppressive state mentally, psychologically, and also how much we project ourselves internationally, as a member of a race. And that is why for us, we are clearly identifying the extent at which the capitalist economic structure, for instance, had rendered us helpless on the continent, so much so that it has become almost impossible for us to even talk about an alternative. We know, for instance, that across the continent, the biggest of companies that are supplying our productive, the basic productive products are actually from the metropolis. Just a way of returning to colonialism, where they get to, extract the basic raw materials and, export them in finished products and sell them to us in the most expensive prices. This is the reality of post-colonial Africa. The entirety of the existing biggest structures, biggest economic productive companies, factories, and what have you, are from the metropolis. And it is bad to such extent that these companies, these factories, they treat persons, individuals, Africans in the most annoying and in the most inhuman ways. Because of course our government had made it, had made it impossible for these persons to even respect our humanity, even on the continent. So it is not, now it is not strange when you get a report that a certain African man or woman was shot down in an industry or a factory owned by Chinese or an Indian in Africa. And you know what? Just the next day, nothing will stop. Nothing, like it's just like nothing happened. The next day, that country gets back to, that factory gets back to work. No one is holding them accountable. They operate in the most ruthless manner. So I'm saying this for us to have a graphical understanding that the necessity of we getting back our minds, as African people, is tied to we destroying the power structure, that has made it possible for us to even be proud of our Africanness in the first instance. Thomas, let me return as a way of closing to submissions that Gavi had provided us with. And I think whether we like it or not, we must continue to advocate for the submissions of Marcus Garvey. The submissions of Marcus Garvey were relevant in the 20th century, and they are still relevant. In fact, the relevance of the submissions of Marcus Garvey, in as much as we identify ourselves as Africans, is eternal. It is timeless. You cannot fix a time where you think the speeches or the submissions of Marcus Garvey would become irrelevant. They would always be relevant. And let me also share that the Pan-African agenda must always be the agenda, because Marcus Garvey was never on the continent. There was no point in time when Marcus Garvey visited the African continent physically. But you know what? Ideologically, Marcus Garvey visited the continent, slept on the continent, fed himself on the continent, did what any ordinary human being would do in visiting a place on the continent. And, he is still with us on the continent, as it is with us, in the global African community. In the 1920s, for instance, 1920s, because I visited the National Archive we have down here. In the 1920s in colonial Lagos, where we had the British colonialists, thieves, the colonial criminals, the British colonial criminals, were scared. We are fearful of several organizations. Yes, they were. But they were more fearful of the Garvey's UNIA chapter in Lagos. As a matter of fact, there were several nationalist organizations in Lagos then in the 1920s. But they paid special attention to Garvey's UNIA to such extent that they had to deny that chapter its meeting place. At several occasions, the meeting place of Garvey's UNIA, was sealed up by the colonial government. They had an intelligence report on the workings of this organization, of this chapter, the chapter of this organization in Lagos. They frustrated their efforts to such extent that Garvey's UNIA Lagos chapter did not survive into the 1930s. But here we are, 2020, discussing Garvey, and its relevance and what have you. So by returning to Garvey's submission as the way of, bringing my discussion to a conclusion, we must understand the basic power structures that has made it impossible for us to liberate ourselves, to liberate our minds. Secondly, we must be more active as we grow in our Pan-African agenda by understanding the fact that what confronts us in our different spaces, the challenges that confront us in our different places are all part and parcel of a major struggle. The question of police brutality, the question of we sending our children to oppressive schools, the question of we exposing our youth to backward musical videos and backward musicians, no matter how much it's preponderant in our different spaces, are all tied to the question of we building a global Black power agenda. We must see how our peculiar realities, are related to the bigger Pan-African agenda. Because if we do not understand this, we won't be able to get the necessary Pan-African solidarity that we need. It was quite, interesting when, it is always interesting when our people on the continent, go to some of these embassies. U.S. embassy, for instance, when our brother, late, George Floyd, was shot by the racist, white police. It is always interesting for us to have, mass of African people on the continent going to American embassy demanding for justice. But also, beyond this, limited protests and what have you, demonstrations and what have you, and they are powerful though. Some of us were saying that we must not just leave all of these issues as just protests and demonstrations on the continent. We must make powerful demands, and we must see to, the implementation of these basic demands. And that is why for us, beyond just marching to all of these embassies, we have, in fact, at different occasions, made proposals that, all of these embassies and also their subsidiaries across the continent are being shut down, because it shouldn't just be a day affair. By so doing, they will realize that, whenever you get rid of one of our own, be it in West Papua, be it in Indonesia, be it in India, millions of us will rise. This is the Pan-African agenda that we're talking about. So I'm urging our persons in the diaspora to also be involved in, raising this banner of a Pan-African agenda. Let us be more practical in our Pan-African agenda, because I know that some of our persons in the diaspora, are privy to some of the experiences that we have on the continent on a daily basis. The exploitation, the killings, the violence, and what have you, which the state, is fond of. For instance, this time last year, I was in a cell, police cell, where we're kept for like a week. What was our offense? I was part of a protest demanding for reparation. So we visited the American embassy in Watakariti in Lagos, and myself and some other comrades of mine who were arrested and were locked up, for more than a week. But we did not get a Pan-African solidarity march from our persons in the diaspora demanding for our release. So I'm saying we have to be practical, in our engagement, because for us, we don't share any illusion in this Nigeria, Ghana, and all these nationalities that we have. If there's any illusion that we share, it is the illusion that they must be destroyed, for us to be able to move forward as, global African people. So there is a necessity for that ability, because without this, we won't be able to project that necessity of we taking back our minds, publicly. The educational system as it is today on the continent and as it is on the diaspora is not our making. If it's not Eurocentric, it is Arab-centric. And there is no way, comrades, that we can develop our own curriculum. We can do all of these things individually. We can do all of these things, in our own small ways. We can educate our kids. We can do all of these things. But in the long run, our kids or we ourselves, we are not existing, or we are not going to exist in a different society, outside this same society that is Eurocentric and that is Arab-centric. We are still existing in this society. Our children are still existing in this society. If they are not exposed to Eurocentric ideas at home, they'll be exposed to Eurocentric ideas on the street. If they are not exposed to Arab-centric ideas at home, they will be exposed to it on the streets, as we have the continent. So no matter how much we try to, no matter how much we try to, destroy all of these things, if we do not put the question of power on the table, we are not going to get to anywhere. We are not going to get to anywhere. We would just be, perambulating as fella would say, going around, going to the same issue that we can easily get rid by confronting the power that be. So I'm saying that the Pan-African agenda must be, revived in the most, vibrant and powerful manner. I want to thank our brothers, the host, for giving us this opportunity to air our minds, because some persons used to say that merely by consistently talking about these things, we would always remind ourselves of the works that needed to be done. Because some of our persons had said that we talk too much. But the point remains that if we do not talk about these things, it is good for us to blend talking with action. But the point still remains that more talks, and more talks, you know, cannot prevent us from doing the necessary works that needed to be done, the actions. So I'm saying that we must continue to talk about this. We must continue to talk about our liberation, because that's what we hold, the Arab social values and also the European social values and what have you. But ultimately, what would save us from all of these things is the action that we put together. And that is why for me, I'll be looking forward to the actions that would emanate from this gathering, powerful gathering, I must say. I thank you all for your time.
Africans, unmute, give the brother some love. Ashe, make some noise. Africans, make some noise. Y'all scared to talk to each other. Come on, let's go. Let's go. Bibi Bohodier. Ashe. Brother Temitope, it was a great lecture. And I'm glad you had the opportunity to come on and speak with us. From the standpoint of when you and I first spoke, and we talked about, the novel Things Fall Apart by Chibe, and how we kind of agreed with how Okonkwo was messed up from the first page because he already had the Arab influence even before the Europeans came on and really destroyed he and his village. So I really appreciated you connecting those dots for us, and expressing that even back home, we are just one family and we're just scattered all across the planet. And I think hearing it from, a family member that's on the continent, gives a little bit more clarity, and it shows that the rumor of, Africans can't get along, or Africans on the continent don't like Africans, that may be in other places. So I really enjoyed the lecture. One of the most important, or one of the most poignant things that stood out to me is when you said, which is shocking, that more of us practice traditional spiritual systems off of the continent. That was very, very just amazing. I think me and another speaker, we began to text back and forth because we both said wow at the same time. But that's scary. That's scary. But thank you so much for taking the time. I know it's much later there. I believe you're about 5 hours ahead of us. So, but thank you for taking the time to spend some time with us and just give us insight on the continent, and to let us know that even on the continent, we are unfortunately behind enemy lines. I think you may have a few questions or comments from the audience, so I'll let them chime in.
Yes, brother. Yes. Knowing what this brother was talking about is just like, man, that confers everything I be talking about to my children, to my consort. And thank you for knowing that I'm just not alone. Hello?
No, he's there, Brother Sundiata. He was having a little bit of issue with his mute.
Okay.
Yeah, but he definitely heard you. So now
Yeah.
if you guys would like to, we still have some speakers and they still have time in the other rooms. So if you guys would like to go to the red and green room, you definitely can.
Okay. All right, great. Thank you.
Thank you, brother. Thank you. Thank you.
Doc shotgun. Yeah. Shot. Intro to O. And my dude, that Timbuktu to Ave. Renew your passion, shun the condition. And not the who, what, when, where, and you are from. At last. Put the higher